So we're going to talk about today is how to organize the paper overall, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, how to build a thesis, for the paper or in general. And you will see that the two things are very, very closely related. Okay. So we're going to start with the thesis, how to build the thesis. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint, which is also what it should be at this point. I've learned to doubt. Should be on the web as well. All right, so here it is. Are you seeing the thesis statement thing?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Very good. All right, and it's clear, you can see it, everything. All right, that's it. Very good. Okay, so what is a thesis? Anyone? You too. Anyone too.
It's
Yes.
the main point.
All right, can you say it loud?
It's the main point of your paper.
The main point of the paper. All right. By the way, I actually have a microphone for this. Let me see if the microphone will improve things. Yes, then we can do karaoke. Yes. All right. So, did you hear the suggestion? The main point of the answer. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes.
I agree.
You agree?
Yep.
Okay. Very good. Say again.
The main idea.
The main idea. Yes. All right. So, this is not a new idea. People have said this before. The main idea, the most important foundational idea, that kind of definition, right? I mean, you can read some of those definitions that I just downloaded from the web. So very good. So what does it mean that something is the main idea, right? We just said it's the main idea of an essay. What does main idea mean? I mean, that's a legitimate question, right?
It talks about what you're going to read.
It talks about what you're going to read. Yes. How do we know that? Anyone? Any thoughts?
Shouldn't it be it's the first sentence of the paragraph to talk about what your paper is going to be about and to explain the whole outline of your research paper, correct?
Yes, and that's what it does. But that's not the question that I'm provocatorily asking. That is, what I'm saying is when we say the main idea, what does main mean? Okay.
Are you asking that the main idea is the primary focus of expression and what's going to be conceptualized and expressed in your writing?
Okay, yeah, that's in a sense what I'm asking. But so let's take it to a slightly different thing. So let's say that I said the main decision that we have to make about the picnic is where we're going. Okay, so what does main mean in this case?
Most important.
Most important, right? Yes, very good. So, that's the idea, right? That is, it's the most important thing, right? But most important can mean almost anything, right? Yes? Yes. And that's the point that I'm making there on the slide, which is that when we say to somebody, oh, you your thesis needs to be the main idea, we're not actually giving them any information at all. Okay, and you know, you've heard this before, because all of you said, or some of you at least said, oh, it's the main idea, etc., etc. But actually, there is no meaning to the main idea. Okay, yeah, it's the most important, it's the one that we're going to talk about. All of this is true, but it gives me no information. Look at it this way. If I said to you, go find the main idea, how would you go about doing that? I should have a sound effect of crickets. It would be.
Let's go find the main idea.
I agree with you. That is, it's a trick question.
Building an argument.
I'm sorry?
Building an argument.
Building an argument, yes. All of that is true, but that's not how you find the main idea, right? That is, let's say that I give you a highlighter and a text, and I say, highlight the main idea. Building an argument isn't going to cut it, right? I mean, there's no way that you can do that, right? I mean, I'm messing with you, you realize, because I am showing to you that what you've been told so far for, you know, through high school, undergraduate work, etc., was a bunch of nonsense. Okay? That is, they're just metaphors. Okay, so if you already know what a thesis statement is, you say, oh, it's the main idea. It's the honcho idea. It's the idea that tells other ideas what to do. It's the ideas that's biggest and baddest. It's the most important idea that's ever been president, and so on and so forth. All of these are nice metaphors that add no knowledge whatsoever unless you already know what you're talking about. Okay? So I know it's confusing because you're saying, what? This, you know, people have been telling me this for 20 years, for 30 years, you know? Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that they were telling you something useful. All right? So let's move on to something a bit more cheerful. Okay, so what actually is the thesis? Okay, well, it's very easy. It's a macro structure. And you may say, well, that doesn't help at all because I don't know what a macro structure is. Okay, well, good point. But we can explain that. Julian, you're making me sick by moving your thing. I'm getting nauseous.
I apologize.
No, it's okay. Don't worry.
My device is dying. I was trying to charge it.
Which, by the way, yes, no, that's an important thing. Which, by the way, you all realize that you can mute or even cut off your video and still hear Steve over there. Okay. Yeah, so I'm not saying do so. Okay, I enjoy seeing you there. But you know, if you have to sneeze, for example, you can mute yourself. Hey, listen. All right. So what is a macro structure? Well, basically, this is stuff that was developed in the late 1970s, early 80s in linguistics. You can think of a macro structure as a really good summary of the text. Okay? So in other words, if you throw out all the unnecessary information about the text, what you're left is the macro structure. Okay? So the way that you build the macro structure is, and you have there on the right of the slide, is you know, deleting information, selecting information. So if you have too much information, you can get rid of some of it. Generalization, that is, you can make you can build an argument at a higher level of generality. So for example, if you say, you know, ducks do this and that, and pelicans do this and that, and doves do this and that, and eagles do this and that, then you can say, well, birds do X. right? So that's the same point, but at a higher level of generalization. You know, construction is a bit more complicated to explain, but you don't need to know this. I'm just sort of trying to demonstrate what a macrostructure is. So in other words, as I said, you can think of a macrostructure as a summary of a text, any text, right? And that's what a thesis really is, okay? So essentially, it's a one-sentence summary of your text, okay? So now, if I gave you a highlighter and I said, go find in the text one sentence that summarizes the whole thing, now you know what to do, right? Now you can find it, okay? Now that is a definition that is operational, that you can actually do it and find it. Okay, so yeah. So let's talk a bit more about this. You know, look at the second bullet point. The main point of the text. You know, that's a very good way of thinking about it. That is, you know, the central point, okay? These are the metaphors that we were talking about. These are fine, okay? I mean, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with saying, oh, it's the central idea. But what does it mean to be the central idea? All right? It means it's the summary of the text, because you've boiled down the text to one sentence, okay? Now, when I say one sentence, you shouldn't take it literally to mean, you know, one sentence. It can be two sentences if you have to, but you should really try not to go beyond that. Another thing that we can say about the thesis is that it's going to be the most general statement of the paper. Okay, there shouldn't be any statement that's more general than that. Now, there might be exceptions to this, and we'll talk about this briefly, in the sense that you may do at the beginning of the paper, sort of introduce the field in a very general way. And so you can say things like, you know, research in psycholinguistics has been very interesting, which is a very general term. Now I'm focusing on, you know, eye tracking, right? Which is, of course, a more specific thing, right? So, but this kind of thing are introductory statements, and they're usually very clearly not very relevant, because then you never talk about psycholinguistics for the rest of the paper, but you talk about eye tracking. So it's very clear that, you know, psycholinguistics was just thrown in to introduce the text. So generally speaking, it will be the most general, the broadest statement that you have. Another way of looking at it, and this is what somebody mentioned before, it's the thing that you're going to prove. It's the thing that your paper is going to demonstrate. It's the point that you're going to make. Right? You know, so another way to look at this is that it's the conclusion, right? Now, this is confusing because you say, well, doesn't the conclusion come at the end? Yes, but you also say it at the beginning, and then it's called your thesis. Okay, it's one of those things. And we'll talk more about that later on, because this drives non-native speakers literally bananas, and we'll talk about it. You know, now, what all of these definitions that we've been playing around, okay, metaphorical and non-metaphorical, the summary of the paper, they all assume that you already have a paper and you're trying to identify the thesis. Right? But we are in the opposite situation, right? Or at least you are. This was an inclusive way, right? You're in the opposite situation, because you have to generate the thesis, right? You know, so that's what we're talking about now. In this case, you're not finding the thesis; you're working it out. You know, you're slowly coming to that conclusion, putting things together. Okay, so the biggest point that I want to make about this is the third bullet point there. Most likely you will have read abundantly before you come up with a thesis. Okay, you know, this happens all the time. Students get excited and they want to jump the gun and say, oh, my thesis is going to be this. And I always say, you don't know what your thesis is going to be because you don't know about the subject well enough to be able to say what your thesis is going to be. You've got to give it, you know, some serious research, and then you'll tell me what your thesis is going to be. Okay, jumping to the conclusion is not a good idea because generally speaking, you fall flat on your face. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples. This is out of a paper that I wrote, so we know it's good. So this is literally the beginning of the paper, okay? And to be helpful, I put a box around the thesis. So it should be fairly clear what the thesis is, right? So let's quickly read through it. So the first sentence is one of those throwaway sentences that I mentioned before. There exists a small but significant literature on the markers of irony and sarcasm. All right, fine, yes. You know, that's just to tell people I'm talking about irony and sarcasm. Leave me alone. Okay, that's what it says. Okay, so then I say in the paper we will review the literature, blah blah blah. Again, this is expected. It's just introductory, and then I get to the point and I say more significantly, and that is a marker that now finally we're getting down to business. Okay, when you say to people, now, all of that I've said so far has been, you know, insignificant. The next thing is the significant part. You're signaling that that's the important stuff is coming, right? It's like putting a big red sign outside the door, right? So we're going to add to the literature. It means this is a new contribution. Okay, that's a sort of academic jargon for saying I'm going to say something new, right? In two ways. One, a contrastive view of pitch as a marker of irony. You don't need to know what that is. You just need to know that it's a point, right? And two, we introduce this facial marker for irony called the blank face, which nobody has done before, right? So those are the 2 points that we're going to make in the paper. And then if you read the rest of the paper, which if you are affected by insomnia, I strongly recommend. It will put you to sleep in seconds. But if you read the rest of the paper, you will find that, my God, we talk about those 2 things. Okay? So that's the one sentence summary of the paper. Yes? No? Are you stunned? Let's hear. Here we have. I heard a yes. She's stunned. Julia, are you there?
I'm here.
Yes. Are you stunned?
Yes.
All right. Very good. Anybody non-stunned? Sharon? No. Sharon looks more puzzled than stunned. I have to say.
I'm great.
Great. All right. Very good. Excellent. Wait, was that ironical?
Blank face?
So that's the one
Blank
sentence.
face. There you go. Oh,
the
very
one sentence thesis.
You get extra credit for that. That was very good. All right, let's look at another example. This is the paper that you actually already read, I think in week 1 or something to think. And this is the first sentence of the essay, right? My title is intended to suggest that the community of scientists is organized in a way which resembles certain features of a body politic and works according to economic principles similar to those by which the production of material goods is regulated. Now, that's pretty dense prose, okay? I mean, he's not kidding around, but lo and behold, it is a one-sentence summary of the whole paper, and a pretty good one at that. Okay, that is, but what Polanyi is saying is, well, basically, it's a social enterprise. That's what body politic means, and it works with the same principles of the free market. All right, that's a one-sentence summary, right? Okay, so these are good, strong theses. Okay, now Polanyi one is pretty heavy-duty. You know, it's a thick prose, but mine, you have to admit, we introduce a contrastive view of pitch as a marker of irony. That's not complicated, right? That's not sophisticated writing. It's just clear, right? I'm just saying that's what we're doing, right? I mean, I'm not being fancy. I'm not trying to do anything particularly clever. I just say that's what we're going to do in this paper, right? And that's all you need to do, by the way, okay? That is, we're not trying to be fancy here. We're just trying to convey information. All right, so there's two kinds of thesis, and we need to be careful about this. One is the overall thesis of the entire work. Okay, so if you have a book, it's the thesis of the entire book. If it's you know, an essay, it's the thesis of the entire essay. If it's a paper, it's the thesis of the entire paper. But then within the paper, the book, the chapter, whatever, there's going to be for every unit a thesis relative to that particular unit. Okay, and in fact, down to the paragraph. Each paragraph has a thesis, which would be a topic sentence. Correct. Very good. So you can think of it as a, you know, are you familiar with Russian dolls? You know, that there's a small doll inside a slightly larger one, etc. That's kind of the same thing. You open one, and then inside it, there's another one, and inside there's another one. So that's exactly the same thing with the thesis of an essay. There's going to be an overall thesis, an overarching thesis that includes the whole thing. That's Polanyi. But then there might be, like, for example, in the paper that, you know, the Eisterhold, Theodor Eisterhold, etc., you know, the multimodal paper, right? There's two parts. Each part is going to have its own thesis, right, which is conveniently summarized there. And then each paragraph within it will have a topic statement that will be the thesis of the paragraph, okay? So you need to keep that in mind. So we can generalize and say the thesis is the main point of the unit, whatever that unit might be, the summary of that unit, okay? But so you're going to have it at different levels of complexity. Now, generally speaking, you need to pay attention at both levels. Give me a second here. This is not good. All right. I'm gonna have to. We're gonna have to take a break because I need to call tech support to have them come back. Okay, so you know, so you need both levels of thesis, both at the paragraph and you know, overall. Okay, and then at each intermediate level as well. You don't really need to worry about the whole thing at this point. That is, we're going to scaffold this in. We're going to start with the paragraph, etc. Right? Now, how do you identify a thesis? Well, usually there are going to be signposts that are going to tell you very clearly. Like the author is going to say, my point is, or there will be a title or sidebar or something like that, right? So, you know, usually it's very well indicated. You know, however, it's not always so, in which case you always have the option of looking for the most general, the least specific statement, okay? Now, usually the thesis is going to be the overall thesis of the essay is going to be in the first paragraph, either at the beginning, or sometimes, as I said, there's going to be background information first, and then you will have your thesis after this sort of palaver at the beginning that doesn't really say much, right? So you can read that at your leisure. I'm not going to go into it, okay? Now, remember I said that your conclusion and your thesis are the same thing, right? And you know, how is that the case? Well, how do you know what your conclusion is if you haven't done the paper yet? Okay, well, you don't actually know. But what happens is that you're kind of bootstrapping yourself into your conclusion, right? So you start with an idea, and then you refine it, and you refine it, and you refine it, and then eventually that idea becomes your thesis. Okay, that is, you kind of, it's like whittling down a piece of wood with a knife. What that implies is that your thesis is going to change. Okay, you don't start with the same thesis at the beginning and end the paper with the thesis unchanged. If that were the case, then you learn nothing in the process of writing the paper, and that would be bad. Okay, your thinking, your information will evolve as you find more stuff and as you yourself think about it. Okay, so you know, you will change the topic and you will change the thesis as your understanding of the topic and the thesis improves. Okay. Now, however, and that's fine. However, you need to be very, very careful not to randomly change your topic. Okay. So because you don't have the time to do that, and that's why it can be a real problem. Okay. So there's a difference here between saying, okay, so let's say that you started with the markers of irony, right? And you say, well, I'm going to investigate how facial expression can communicate irony, right? As you're working on this, you discover that nobody's ever said anything about blank face, right? So therefore, you shift your thesis to the blank face, right? Because you now have found a gap in the literature and you want to talk about this, right? So that's a good changing of the topic, because it means you've narrowed down your topic. You started with facial expression, now you've narrowed it down to the blank face, right? Which is a much narrower thing than every facial expression that you can have, right? So that is a positive narrowing of the topic. But let's say that you start looking at facial expression and you realize, well, I can't find anything. I'm going to look at politeness. Okay, that's a bad change of topic. Okay, and that I really, really warn you, don't do that. Okay, and if you are in a situation where you say, well, I can't find anything, I have to change my topic, then talk to me before you do that. Okay, because that is a surefire way of failing. Okay, so you know, don't do that. Now, if you're struggling and you say, well, I don't like the topic anymore, you know, then you need to say, okay, what's the problem? Is it that you cannot find enough information? You're finding too much information? You don't understand it? I mean, there usually is a problem, and if we can solve the problem, then the problem goes away. If we cannot solve it, then we need to work on changing your topic until you can actually do it. Okay, and that's where you need to talk to me. Because if you're struggling, then by definition, you should be talking to me. Okay, so generally speaking, you don't understand something, something is not going the way you expect that it would go, then you call me. Okay, all right, so conclusion here, the thesis is the most abstract statement of the text. It's equivalent to the conclusion. There are theses at all levels of the text. Usually they're signposted. You should signpost them. Okay, if the authors that you're reading are misbehaved, that's bad, but you should be well behaved and signpost them. And your thesis is going to change during your writing, and that's fine. That's to be expected. Okay, so you shouldn't say, oh, I've written down my thesis, a week ago, and that is the thesis that will be in my paper in 3 months. If that's the case, something went wrong. Okay, all right, so that's that. Any questions, anyone?
Dr. Attardo,
Yes.
your signpost in the thesis that you gave us as an example is more significantly?
Yeah.
Okay.
That and saying, we're going to add in 2 ways. That's a pretty clear sign that there's going to be 2 parts to the thesis and so on.
Okay.
Other forms of signpostings are, my thesis in this paper will be, that usually works.
There are many different ways to
Yes.
signpost.
Yeah, I mean, you can signpost any way you want,
Oh,
Yes.
I have a question. You said it can be in the beginning of the paper.
Yeah, it has to be in the
It
beginning.
has to be in the
Yes.
beginning. But the theory about textual writing, how different languages influence how people write.
Right. Okay, we're going to talk about that. I have a specific lecture about that. So we're not going to go into cultural differences on that. I mean, and it is indeed very true. There are huge differences depending on the language that you speak on where the thesis gets placed. Okay, but we're going to talk about that. And as I said, it makes it very complicated for non-native speakers. But we're going to talk about that. There's going to be a specific lecture about that. All right, any other questions?
So basically, we're going to say our thesis in the very beginning is our conclusion. But also, when you say thesis can also be every paragraph.
Yes.
Do you want us to also do that as well?
Absolutely. Every paragraph must have a thesis. That's the subject of the next lecture that I'm going to do in a few minutes. Okay,